The title is Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story. It's an award-winning documentary that chronicles the trials, tribulations, and triumphs of St. Augustine High School in its quest to racially integrate high school athletics in the state of Louisiana, and the brilliance of a Hall of Fame coach who directed the school's football team to unprecedented success. And you can see it right here on WLAE-TV Sunday, February 16th at 7 p.m. Hello, I'm Ro Brown, and welcome to the making of Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story. During the next half hour, we'll visit with someone who was part of this historic time as a student athlete and a coach. We'll check in with the film's editor to find out about the actual making of this project. But first, joining us is the person who conceived, wrote, directed, produced, executive produced, in just about everything Before the West Coast, Oyd Craddock. Oyd, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Ro.
All right, how long you been at this thing? You know, most people think that you can put these things together in about a couple months. No.
Well, actually, this month, January 2020, it's 8 years ago that the idea was conceived. Mm-hmm. It really followed my attendance at Coach Otis Washington's Hall of Fame induction, Louisiana High School Athletic Association Hall of Fame induction, January 2012. Mm-hmm. And I found myself, I flew in from Atlanta and attended the event in Baton Rouge, and found myself reflecting on my experience as a student athlete at St. Augustine. That event actually was centered two other key life events for me. I had just retired from a 31-year career in business with the IBM Corporation. Mm-hmm. I didn't have any background in film, and the other thing was there was a tragedy in my family with my grandfather's death. Kind of left me reflecting on my life as a child and also as a student at St. Aug. He was my biggest inspiration to get a great education. So here I am reflecting on those years, the impact had on my life, and also wanting to get some additional recognition for Coach Washington. Mm-hmm.
Okay, this might be an unfair question off the top. Why do I want to watch this?
Well, this film captures a significant part of New Orleans and Louisiana history. In fact, history of our country. We're talking about a major transition of New Orleans from a segregated city to an integrated city. African Americans taking on roles and responsibilities of leadership in the city. And high school football during those times, the late 60s and 70s, it was big entertainment in the city. You know, this preceded the internet and cable television, electronic games and cell phones, so a lot of visibility. But this high school football at this time and what St. Augustine did, it changed how the races viewed each other in the city.
Yeah, I think you told me one time this didn't start out as a film. What does that mean? What was it going to be?
Well, originally, I was going to create a great photo gallery because when I spent time with Coach Washington at the Hall of Fame induction, he had lots of photos. He had them in a large bag, and I was digitizing photos at my home at the time. And I said, Coach, let me digitize these for you so you could look at them on the computer and all of that. And so I spent time with those photos and just looking at the photos. And most of them black and white photos, just remembering that time really kind of got me engrossed into what was going on and the significance of that period. So it was just going to be a photo gallery. But then, months later, when I interviewed some of the St. Augustine student athletes from the period, because I wanted to incorporate a few video clips of guys who had played there. What was it like to be at St. Augustine during that time and to play football for Coach Washington? And everything changed. And that's when it moved to be a bigger story, a story about what the football meant to the players and to the community.
I think most people would understand a sports civil rights story in the title, but what does Before the West Coast mean?
Well, Before the West Coast is the part of the title that's a tribute to Coach Otis Washington. Coach Washington was a high school football coaching genius. He was ahead of his time. He was actually running concepts of the West Coast offense that became renowned in pro football in the 80s. He was running that concept in the 70s. So he was ahead of his time. And so that is the tribute to him and his leadership, his innovation. He was running the West Coast before the West Coast.
Okay. What do you hope to accomplish with this? What did you, and have you, since it's been around a little while now?
Well, what I'd hope to accomplish, and it's unfolding, and this broadcast is key, and that is for current generation of young people and future generations to be more informed about that time, the 60s and 70s, and the significance of that time, and to be inspired. It was a period of time that inspired me, it shaped me, developed me, and people are going to learn that you've got to persevere through challenges to be successful in life, and that's embedded in this film, how we overcame the adversity, and hopefully to inspire generations to come.
First time you ever created a film, what made you think you could do it?
Well, I said I had a career in business, right, which was a very demanding and challenging career. I was in management, middle management when I left. So I had project management skills, the ability to collaborate, lead teams, and that's what I did. I put together a team of young professionals who were trained in film and editing, visual effects, and was able to collaborate with them to make it happen.
You're watching the making of Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story, an award-winning documentary that you can see right here on WLAE-TV on February 16th. That's Sunday evening at 7 p.m. We'll take a break right now, but we'll be back with more of the making of Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story.
Here's your chance to own a collector's edition of Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story. This includes a 50-page photo book filled with pictures of Coach Otis Washington, his staff, and many of the great St. Aug players. Also included is a Blu-ray and DVD copy of the program with 55 minutes of bonus interviews. You'll also receive a CD with 13 songs from the 1973 St. Aug Marching 100. To make this treasured collection your own, go to beforethewestcoast.com.
Welcome back to the making of Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story. I'm Ro Brown. Oyd Craddock, producer, writer, director, and everything is with us. And he is joined now by the editor of this outstanding piece of work, and it's Adam Intriago. Adam, how are you doing? Good to have you here with us.
I'm doing well.
22 years old. How'd you get hooked up into this? How did you meet this guy?
Well, I was working with a guy who knew him from when they played football together back in the day, and I think you had maybe asked him to work on it first, and he didn't quite have the time, and I was kind of just starting out, so I think I sort of was in a better position to start on something like this, and that's kind of how we got started on it. Yeah.
You know, and from your standpoint, like I said, you're a first-time filmmaker, so this guy is probably pretty important in this process.
Absolutely. And I trusted Travis Durancelet, who was my classmate and teammate that worked with Adam, recommended Adam, and so I knew we would collaborate well. I had to rely on his skill. I knew the story, and I also had an attention to detail about me from my background and the ability to manage projects. So I was able to communicate to Adam and tell him what I was looking for, and then rely on his artistic talent to make it happen.
Adam, you are from Jacksonville, Florida.
That's correct.
You are in your 20s.
Yep.
You weren't around for any of this.
No.
You're not exactly a football fan.
No.
So, I guess this was a learning experience for you in more ways than one. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, basically everything that this documentary is about, I have zero context for going into it. Mm-hmm. I'm not from here. As you said, I never was involved in sports or knew much about it. So coming into it, it was sort of a blessing and a curse in some ways. Like in some ways, it at times made it difficult to understand what was going on with the game footage because I don't know what's happening.
Right.
But in another aspect of it, it was kind of a great blessing because I was able to really look at it from a story standpoint and figure out how to craft the best story out of what was going on, and just relied on Oid for the football stuff.
It's a good time to talk about, like you said, this is an 8-year process, basically, Oid.
Right.
I mean, just talk about putting all this stuff together, with working with all these different people like Adam and the whole works, and you being a first-time filmmaker, not really knowing what you're doing, to tell you the truth, in that respect.
Right. Worked on it a year and a half, focused on finding content, photos and the footage and putting all of that together. And then something big happened. I got recruited to return to St. Augustine as the president of the school, and so got focused on that. So we put the film on the shelf for 3 years, just prior to being finished. 2 pieces weren't done. We didn't have the visual effects finalized, and I didn't have the narrator on tape yet, the narrator that I wanted, which was Wendell Pierce, acclaimed actor here from the city. So it was 4 years in the makings before we completed it, which created some technical challenges in terms of the files and the applications we use to edit and so forth. But it made the journey a little more challenging, but more rewarding as well.
The reason why Oid made this film, Adam, was to educate people about some things. What are the biggest things you learned in doing this? Well,
a lot of stuff. I really didn't, coming to move to New Orleans, I really didn't understand the importance of football and the culture here, and more specifically the importance of high school Catholic football. And so I was very much educated on that. And I don't think I really had context for how a high school football team could have such a big impact on the civil rights activity in the city at that time. So I was just really, that was the thing that really captivated me about the story, was how, seemingly a small entity could have such a big impact on such a large space.
How difficult was he to work for?
I think he's like one of the better people that I've worked with, just because he's so meticulous. When we came to sit down for an editing session, he would come with these spreadsheets of it's just these list of segments that he's timed out perfectly, of down to the frame of, I want this segment, and this segment. And so in a lot of ways it made my job a lot easier as an editor, because he knew exactly what he wanted, while the way he communicated wasn't so traditional from other directors I've worked with. It was still very precise, so I'd say he's pretty good to work with. Yeah.
Admiration for what this guy can do?
Absolutely. Adam's a talent. And what's great is, because this project took place over a number of years, I watched his talent get better and better, right? We worked together a year and a half, put it on the shelf for 3 years, so when we came back together, he was at another level. And his utilization of his tools and ability to advise me.
Adam Intriago, editor of Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story. Thank you for joining us here on the making of Before the West Coast. Yeah. And when we return from a break, we'll talk to Tony Biagas, who was a player and a student athlete and a coach at St. Augustine High School. But first, let's take a look at a trailer of Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story.
Coach Walsh and the football team are like Jackie Robinson. They were determined to show the community and the world that it could happen.
It was part of the civil rights movement. You actually saw whites and blacks competing on the field.
I think the social impact was bigger than the sports impact because it was the first time that an all-black school would compete in the Catholic League. Everybody in the black community rallied around St. Augustine.
We had to have someone, when we go line up against an all-white team and someone calls you a racial name, you can't fight them.
I remember going down there, being escorted into the parish, police dogs around us as we got off the bus.
We felt like we were playing everybody else plus the referees.
And as a result of that, losing 19 players, I don't know what team could survive losing 19 players.
Every week, it seemed like we had the burdens of the whole community on our backs. This was the time when things were starting to change.
And I made a promise to myself, one day, everybody in here is going to know the name of St. Albert, because we're going to beat the living hell out of everybody we play.
Just a little taste of Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story. If that doesn't make you want to see this film, well, I don't know what will. February 16th, Sunday, it's at 7 p.m. right here on WLAE. Now joining Oyd Craddock and myself here on the set of the making of Before the West Coast, a guy who, I got two St. Aug football players here. Now, you're not the only one that played, okay? Class of 1971. And head football coach at St. Augustine from 1986 to 2001, and an assistant coach under Otis Washington, the man that we will talk about in this segment. Tony Villegas, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here, Ro.
Okay. Now, you are an Otis Washington product through and through because you played for him, you coached with him, the whole works, and then to some degree, you succeeded him as head football coach at St. Aug in a lot of ways. Yes. What made the man he was to you?
He affected so many young men's and even older men's lives, you know, over the course of his life. He was a great man. He was a great leader. He was a man who was inspirational to people. He was the cause of me being the person that I am, you know. I played for him in the early 70s and then went on to college and came back and coached under him at St. Aug and coached under him again at Southern, you know. If not for Otis, I probably would have gone on to law school. And I'm happy that I didn't because I had a great life being a football coach. So he was an inspirational leader that people wanted to follow and try to emulate, you know. So he was a great man.
Oyd, what would you say about that?
In terms of coach, it was an honor to play for Coach Washington. You know, I played defense, so I didn't have the direct position interaction with him. So I got a chance to see how he brought us all together and the way he led his staff, great rapport and command of you know, the group of men that they worked tremendously as a team, and got to see him be a psychologist on a few occasions. But it was just so great to be around someone with his leadership and commitment to the game and commitment to making all of us better young men.
Yeah. Tony, you worked with him. Not only did he coach you, but you worked with him, you know, at Southern University, you know, and at St. Augustine before that. What was that like? How different was it to play for him and then work with him?
Well, in some ways it was very similar. Otis was a disciplinarian, and that extended to his coaching staff. And I think I mentioned at a meeting once before that as an assistant coach, when we were on the way to Sunday afternoon meetings to watch the film from the game before, I was just as apprehensive as I had been as a player when I knew I had made a mistake and I didn't want the coach to chew me out. As a coach, I felt that way on the way to Otis's home, knowing that maybe my guys hadn't played as well as we had hoped they would, and I was worried about the comments he would make to me, you know. So he was a disciplinarian even with his coaches, but he had a way of doing this. He could chew you out like no one else could, but in the next minute, he was back to being regular Otis again, and everything was gone. There was no lasting animosity. There was no lasting, we got a feud going, or there's some controversy here. It was 1 minute, this is what we need to say, it's said, it's done, let's move on.
Was that part of being the psychologist, like you said?
Absolutely. He did that to our team our senior year in 1975. At the beginning of practice in the summer, he chewed us out like I had never seen him before. And it really inspired us to really commit ourselves to be very, very focused, because the 2 prior years didn't live up to our expectations. So he told us how bad we were, and we stunk up the place. And later on, I would learn from him that he thought just the opposite. He knew we would be a great team that year, and he didn't want us. He knew we would probably be ranked #1 in the state in preseason, so he didn't want that to go to our heads. So it worked.
And that was a 15-0 state championship team, as it turned out, in 1975. Teacher, X's and O's. How good was he there?
He was excellent. He knew, #1, what the guys needed. There were times when I first started coaching and I thought I was a genius, and I would come in and I would spend all weekend and I had this great plan drawn up, you know, and I would bring it to him. He'd say, this looks really good, Villegas, but the kids can't learn this. And we can do this, so this will work. The kids are not going to learn this. And I learned after repeated attempts that he was absolutely right. You know, the times that he did let me go ahead to prove his point that the kids weren't going to learn what I had on the paper, it didn't work. So I finally learned after several attempts that you have to do what the kids can do, #1, you know. So
Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story. Coach Washington was from Selma, Alabama. So I always thought that he was cognizant of the entire civil rights movement and everything that had to do with it. Some people would say that he just wanted to be a football coach. You think he was cognizant of the effect he was having and the effect that, you know, you guys were having on the civil rights movement here in New Orleans?
There's no doubt. I mean, sports was the one area, especially in the city of New Orleans, where once we got into the LHSAA, there was an intermingling, and not only that, a competition to show whether or not, because the theory was in those days, young black men cannot compete with young white men. And we were the force there, the sole force at one point, to prove that we could compete, we could be competitive, and we could be successful. And he was aware of that the entire time. He never gave big speeches about it.
Right.
But I can tell you, as a player on those teams and as a coach later on, that was always in the back of our mind. It was because of that seed that he planted in us and the way that he worked to prove that we were going to be successful. Determination was a big part of what he was all about, and he was significant in the civil rights movement in New Orleans.
St. Augustine went to court in 1967, winning the case, that integrated prep sports in the state of Louisiana. Just talk a little bit about that.
Well, the case obviously changed the course of Louisiana, but I had some research done years later after hearing from our athletic director back in 1975 that the case in Louisiana, our case, set a precedent that was referenced by cases around the country. Some 32 states had cases, or some 77 cases referenced our case. So it's really a point of pride that the state of Louisiana, city of New Orleans, St. Augustine High School helped change the course for civil rights around the country.
We have about a minute or so left. What would you say? Well, just give me your thoughts on Coach Otis Washington and just basically on this documentary, because he is pretty much the central figure, if there is one, in this one. Oy?
The biggest thing is lead by example. That's what Coach lived by. He didn't talk about a lot of what was going on inside of him in terms of what he intended to impact and how he wanted to impact our lives. the other thing is leadership matters. You know, and we really need to recognize it today. It matters. So how a leader behaves, conducts themselves, communicate, shapes the people around them, and Coach was a model example of leadership, great leadership.
Anthony Villegas, St. Augustine class of 71, and the winningest football coach in St. Augustine history. I will say that. I know you don't like to hear me say that, but I will because you are. Thank you for joining us. And Oyd, great job on this documentary, something that you should be really proud of and something I think everyone needs to see.
Thanks, Ro.
You've been watching the making of Before the West Coast, a sports civil rights story. And don't forget, you can see it right here on WLAE-TV. That's Sunday, February 16th at 7 p.m. Once again, thank you for watching. Tony, Oyd, we'll see you next time.